While most police officers carry out their duties with honor and integrity, a few have abused their power, betrayed the public trust, and committed heinous crimes. From brutal murders to organized crime, these 10 officers crossed the line and faced the consequences of their actions. Join us as we explore their stories, the evidence against them, and the sentences they received for their crimes. Number 1. Wayne Jenkins. Wayne Jenkins was a former police officer and gun trace task force leader in Baltimore, Maryland. The Gun Trace Task Force was a specialized unit of the Baltimore Police Department that was responsible for investigating violent crimes and illegal firearms trafficking. Jenkins had served as a police officer for over a decade before his career ended when he was implicated in a wide-ranging corruption scandal. The investigation into Jenkins and the Gun Trace Task Force began in 2015 when the FBI received a tip that unit members were committing robberies while on duty. The FBI launched an investigation and discovered that Jenkins and his team indulged in various illegal activities, including extortion, theft, drug dealing, and planting evidence. Jenkins was the task force's leader and used his position to orchestrate many of the illegal activities. He and his team routinely robbed drug dealers and others they believed had cash and drugs. They would steal money and drugs and then sell them on the street for profit. They also planted evidence on suspects to bolster their cases and obtain convictions. Jenkins and his team were eventually caught when they robbed a man who was an FBI informant. It led to a lengthy investigation that revealed the full extent of their criminal activities. In 2017, Jenkins and 6 other officers were indicted on federal racketeering charges. The case against Jenkins and the Gun Trace Task Force was one of the most extensive corruption investigations in the history of Baltimore Police Department. The investigation exposed significant flaws within the department's internal accountability systems, including a lack of oversight and a culture of impunity. In 2018, Jenkins pleaded guilty to several charges, including racketeering, robbery, and filing false reports. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Jenkins' sentencing was a significant moment in the investigation, as he was considered the ringleader of the criminal enterprise. Jenkins' sentence reminded other police officers and public officials that law enforcement would not tolerate corruption in law enforcement. It was also a reminder that the actions of a few bad actors could profoundly impact the community's trust in the police. Overall, Wayne Jenkins' case is a cautionary tale of the importance of integrity in law enforcement and the devastating impact of corruption on public trust and safety. While the vast majority of police officers are honest and dedicated public servants, it's essential to hold those who engage in corrupt activities accountable for their actions. The case against Jenkins and the Gun Trace Task Force underscores the importance of robust oversight and accountability mechanisms to prevent corruption and ensure that police officers uphold their duty to serve and protect their communities. Number 2. Michael Dotro. Michael Dotro was a police officer in the township of Edison, New Jersey, who committed multiple crimes, including arson, conspiracy to commit official misconduct, and stalking. In 2013, Dotro set fire to the home of a superior officer with whom he had a disagreement with. The officer's family, including 2 children, were inside the home at the time, but fortunately, no one was injured. Dotro also attempted to burn down the home of another police officer he perceived as a rival. In addition to arson, Dotro was charged with conspiracy to commit official misconduct for using police resources to access information about individuals involved in a lawsuit against him. Dotro's legal troubles continued when he stalked his former girlfriend and made false police reports about her. He used his position as a police officer to harass and intimidate her, and even installed a tracking device on her car. He was charged with stalking, falsifying a police report, and computer theft. In 2017, Dotro pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit official misconduct and 1 count of arson. In exchange for his plea, prosecutors dropped the remaining charges against him. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison and is not eligible for parole until he serves at least 17 years. The case of Michael Dotro is a stark reminder of the importance of upholding the law, even for those in positions of authority. Dotro's actions were a blatant abuse of his power as a police officer and endangered the lives of innocent people. It's crucial for law enforcement agencies to thoroughly vet and monitor their officers to prevent such abuses from ever occurring. Furthermore, the case highlights the need for accountability and consequences for those who engage in criminal behavior, especially when it involves stalking and harassment. It's essential to support the resources of victims of these crimes and uphold perpetrators accountable for their actions. Number 3. Daniel Holtzclaw. Daniel Holtzclaw was a former Oklahoma City police officer convicted of sexually assaulting multiple women on duty. Holtzclaw committed the crimes between December 2013 and June 2014, while Holtzclaw patrolled a low-income neighborhood. Holtzclaw targeted vulnerable women, including those with outstanding warrants or who had criminal histories, believing they would be less likely to report the assaults. He used his position of authority to coerce these women into sexual acts, threatening them with arrest if they did not comply. Holtzclaw's crimes were first brought to light when a woman reported that he had sexually assaulted her during a traffic stop. It led to an investigation which uncovered a pattern of abuse that spanned several months. In total, 13 women came forward with allegations against Holtzclaw. The women described similar experiences, with Holtzclaw using his power to intimidate and manipulate them. He would often perform searches or pat-downs that escalated into sexual assaults. He also made suggestive comments and demanded sexual favors in exchange for leniency. During his trial, Holtzclaw maintained his innocence, claiming that the women had fabricated the allegations as part of a conspiracy against him. However, the jury found him guilty on 18 counts, and the judge sentenced Holtzclaw to 263 years in prison. Holtzclaw's crimes devastated his victims, who were already struggling with poverty, addiction, or mental health issues. They were left traumatized and ashamed, with few resources for support or justice. The case of Daniel Holtzclaw represents a disturbing example of the power dynamics and systemic issues that contribute to police brutality and sexual violence. The case also highlights the complex intersection of race, class, and gender in cases of sexual assault. Holtzclaw's victims were predominantly women of color, many struggling with poverty, addiction, or mental illness. These factors made them vulnerable to abuse and less likely to receive support or justice. The fact that Holtzclaw specifically targeted these women underscores the need for a broader conversation about how systemic inequality perpetuates cycles of violence. Furthermore, the trial and conviction of Holtzclaw raised ethical questions about the role of law enforcement in society. As public servants, citizens entrust police officers with protecting and serving their communities. When they abuse that power, they harm individuals and erode the public's trust in law enforcement. Number 4. Zachary Wester. Zachary Wester was a former sheriff's deputy in Jackson County, Florida, who was accused of planting drugs on motorists during traffic stops and arresting them on false charges. The investigation into Wester's conduct began in 2018 when a prosecutor in Jackson County noticed irregularities in the case that Wester was bringing to court. The prosecutor contacted the FDLE, which investigated Wester's conduct. The investigation uncovered a pattern of misconduct and abuse of power that had been ongoing for several years, ultimately leading to his arrest and conviction on numerous charges. According to the FDLE investigation, Wester routinely conducted illegal searches of vehicles during traffic stops and planted drugs or other contraband on motorists. He would then arrest the motorists on false charges and submit false reports to cover up his actions. In some cases, Wester also stole money from the motorists he arrested. The investigation uncovered numerous instances of Wester's misconduct, including at least 12 cases where he wrongly arrested motorists on drug charges. In one case, Wester was caught on his body camera planting a bag of illegal substances in a woman's car. In another case, he arrested a man on drug charges after finding a syringe in the man's truck, even though the syringe was later found to contain no drugs. In August of 2019, Wester was fired from his position as a deputy sheriff. In July 2020, he was arrested and charged with numerous crimes, including racketeering, official misconduct, fabricating evidence, false imprisonment, and drug possession. The court was also charging him with perjury for lying under oath about his conduct during a 2018 custody hearing. In May 2021, Wester was found guilty of 19 of the 67 charges against him, including racketeering, official misconduct, fabricating evidence, false imprisonment, and drug possession. In July 2021, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison for his crimes, and the judge ordered him to pay restitution to his victims. Number 5. Dennis Perkins. Dennis Perkins was a former police officer in Louisiana convicted of sexual crimes against children. The abuse came to light in 2017 when a victim disclosed it to a school counselor, who then reported it to law enforcement. Perkins was arrested in August 2017 and charged with 60 counts of child sexual abuse. At trial, the victims testified about the abuse they suffered at the hands of Perkins. The prosecution also presented evidence, such as text messages and photographs, that supported the victims' accounts. In his defense, Perkins claimed that the allegations were part of a conspiracy against him, and that the victims had been coached to lie. However, the judge sentenced him to 100 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Perkins' case drew national attention due to his background as a police officer. Perkins had worked for several law enforcement agencies, including the Livingston Parish Sheriff's Office, the Baton Rouge Police Department, and the Louisiana Attorney General's Office. His conviction raised questions about how he can continue working in law enforcement despite misconduct allegations. Following Perkins' conviction, his wife, Cynthia Perkins, who was also arrested and charged with obstruction of justice. She was accused of bribing one of the victims to recant their testimony and attempt to intimidate this witness. Cynthia Perkins pled guilty to the charges, and as a part of the plea deal, the judge sentenced her to 41 years in prison. Number 6. Braulio Gonzalez. Braulio Gonzalez, a former lieutenant with the Miami-Dade Police Department, was accused of sexually molesting 2 young girls, one of whom was a family member, at gunpoint. He was charged with 7 counts of lewd and lascivious molestation of a child and 1 count of kidnapping. The incidents allegedly occurred for 2 years, beginning in 2011 and ending in 2013 when the victims turned 10. The kidnapping charge was related to his alleged actions during what the jury agreed was his first encounter with one of the minors. He was accused of waking her up, pointing a firearm at her head, and telling her that he would unalive her sibling sleeping in the same bed if she didn't follow him. Gonzalez led the victim to his bedroom and sexually assaulted her repeatedly over the next 2 years. Gonzalez was arrested in 2018 after one of the victims told her psychologist about the sexual assault. He was put under house arrest while awaiting trial, and the department continued to pay him his salary even after his arrest. 9 months after his indictment, another victim came forward, and Gonzalez was sent to jail before trial. He remained incarcerated and maintained his innocence even as the jury convicted him on all counts. The judge sentenced Gonzalez to life in prison for his crimes. He is appealing the verdict. Police records indicate that Gonzalez allegedly assaulted other women before the charges that led to the conviction this week. 3 of his ex-girlfriends claim to have suffered severe injuries after Gonzalez reportedly attacked them, with one suffering a broken nose and another a broken arm, according to police reports. 2 of the women claimed he pointed a firearm at them as well. Despite his superior's knowledge of these incidents, Gonzalez did not lose his job with the Miami-Dade police force. Number 7. Kenneth Blue. Kenneth Blue's crimes as a former police officer shocked the community and law enforcement officials alike. The murder of Jennifer Webb, a 32-year-old pregnant woman, was a particularly heinous crime that Blue committed. According to reports, Blue was the father of Webb's unborn child, but he was married and wanted to keep their affair hidden. He reportedly convinced Webb to meet him in a scheduled area to discuss child support. Once there, Blue allegedly shot Webb and left her to die. A passing motorist found Webb's body and called 911. Investigators were able to track down Blue as a suspect, and evidence, including a bullet casing and a tire track, linked him to the crime scene. In addition, an inmate who had shared a cell with Blue reportedly came forward with information that Blue had confessed to the murder. During the trial, the prosecution presented a wealth of evidence against Blue, including DNA evidence that confirmed he was the father of Webb's unborn child. The defense attempted to argue that Blue was not mentally competent at the time of the murder. Still, the jury ultimately rejected this argument and found him guilty of first-degree murder. Blue was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that was handed down with the hope that it would bring some measure of justice for Jennifer Webb and her family. The case also led to a review of police procedures and protocols and increased awareness about domestic violence and the dangers of police officers who abuse their power. The case of Kenneth Blue serves as a stark reminder as the potential dangers that can arise when individuals in positions of authority abuse their power. As a police officer, Blue was entrusted to protect and serve the community, but instead he used his position to commit a heinous crime and cover up an affair. The consequences of his actions were devastating, not just for Jennifer Webb, but for her family, the community, and the reputation of law enforcement as a whole. While the sentencing of Blue brought some closure for those affected by this crime, it also raised important questions about the need for increased oversight and accountability for law enforcement officials. In the wake of the case, many have called for better training and support for police officers and increased scrutiny of police officers who exhibit signs of mental illness or instability. Number 8. David Carrick. David Carrick had a short stint in the British Army before joining the Metropolitan Police as a police officer in 2001. In 2009, he became part of the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Team. However, in 2002, allegations of domestic abuse were levied against him. Despite receiving multiple complaints about his behavior, Carrick was recertified to remain an armed police officer in 2017. His colleagues called him Bastard Dave due to his penchant for cruelty. Between 2003 and 2020, Carrick met several women on dating apps like Badoo and Timber, whom he later abused and sexually assaulted. Using his job as an armed police officer, he gained their trust and controlled them through physical and emotional abuse. Carrick degraded his victims physically and sexually assaulted them and imprisoned them in small spaces. In October 2021, another woman reported that Carrick had sexually assaulted her a year earlier. She decided to come forward in response to the kidnapping, sexual assault, and death of Sarah Everard by another Metropolitan Police officer. Carrick was arrested and suspended from police work. Initially, he pleaded not guilty to all charges against him. In December of 2022, at the Old Bailey Criminal Court in central London, Carrick pleaded guilty to 49 charges, including 24 charges of sexual assault involving 12 female victims. On 16th of January 2023, at Southwark Crown Court, he pleaded guilty to 4 more charges. In the aftermath of Carrick's conviction, the Metropolitan Police re-examined past claims of domestic abuse or sexual offenses against Met officers and staff and investigated around 1,000 of its 45,000 employees. Carrick's sentencing began on the 6th of February 2023 at Southwark Crown Court. He received 36 life sentences with a minimum term of 30 years plus 239 days on the 7th of February 2023, meaning he must serve that long in prison before becoming eligible for parole. He'll become eligible for parole on 2nd of May 2052. Number 9. Wayne Couzens. Wayne Couzens was a former Metropolitan Police officer who worked for the force for nearly a decade. He was serving as a member of the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command at the time of his arrest. It's the same unit where David Carrick worked, who was also a former police officer with the Metropolitan Police. Both men abused their power and position as police officers to commit heinous crimes against vulnerable women. He was convicted of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of Sarah Everard in March of 2021. Everard was walking home from a friend's house in South London when Couzens abducted her, and Everard was found in a wood area in Kent. The case sparked widespread outrage and protests over the issue of violence against women in the UK. Couzens, who had served in the Metropolitan Police since 2018, was arrested shortly after Everard's disappearance. During his trial, which took place in September and October of 2021, he pleaded guilty to all 3 charges against him. The court heard how he had used his police training and equipment, including handcuffs and a police ID, to kidnap Everard and then sexually assault and take her life. In December of 2021, Couzens was sentenced to a whole life term in prison, which means he will never, ever be released. The judge described his crimes as a betrayal of trust that the public places in police officers, and said he had shown no remorse for his actions. The sentence was welcomed by Everard's family and campaigners against violence against women. Couzens also raised questions about the issue of violence against women in the UK and sparked a broader debate about the treatment of women by the police. The Met Police faced criticism over the handling of the case, particularly its use of heavy-handed tactics had a vigil for Everett and its failure to investigate allegations of sexual misconduct by police officers appropriately. In response to the case, the UK government announced a series of measures aimed at tackling violence against women, including the creation of a new police watchdog to investigate complaints of police misconduct and the appointment of a new victims commissioner to support victims of crime. The case also led to the introduction of a new law, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which includes stricter sentences for crimes against women and girls and new measures to protect victims of domestic abuse. Number 10. Michael Valva. Michael Valva was a former New York City police officer convicted of second-degree murder in the death of his 8-year-old son, Thomas Valva, and sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. The case began on January 17, 2020, when Michael Valva called 911 to report that his son Thomas had fallen in their home and was not breathing. Thomas was rushed to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. However, an autopsy revealed that Thomas had passed of hypothermia, and investigators ruled it as a homicide. Further investigation revealed that Thomas had been subjected to horrific abuse by Michael Valva and his fiancée, Angela Polina, who was also charged with second degree. Thomas and his older brother Anthony had been forced to sleep in an unheated garage as punishment for wetting the bed. Temperatures in the garage reportedly fell as low as 19 degrees Fahrenheit, -7 degrees Celsius, causing Thomas to suffer severe hypothermia. Prosecutors also presented evidence that Michael Valva had a history of abusing his children, including Thomas and Anthony. Valva's ex-wife, Justina Zabka Valva, had reported the Child Protective Services that Valva was abusive toward their children and had a history of neglecting them. However, despite these reports, Valva was able to retain custody of his children. During the trial, jurors heard audio recordings in which Michael and Polina mocked and ridiculed Thomas as he took his last breaths. The recording also revealed Valva saying he didn't care whether Thomas lived or not. On March 25, 2021, Michael Valva was convicted of second-degree murder and endangering the welfare of a child. The judge sentenced him to 40 years to life in prison. Angela Polina was also convicted of second-degree murder and received the same sentence. The case sparked outrage and calls for reform in New York State's child welfare system. Critics accused Child Protective Services of failing to intervene despite multiple reports of abuse, and lawmakers proposed reforms to improve the system's response to reports of child abuse and neglect. The issue of corrupt police officers is often complex and troubling. While most law enforcement officers serve with integrity and honor, there have been instances of corruption and abuse of power. So it's crucial for communities to hold police officers accountable for their actions and for departments to have robust surveillance mechanisms. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.